Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here again to really get into the weeds on topics that matter.
Hmm.
And today we're tackling one that's, well, it's constantly in the news, sparking some really intense public conversation.
Okay.
Immigration.
Yeah, specifically the connection or the perceived connection between immigration and crime rates here in the U.S.
Exactly. It's a topic that generates a lot of heat, a lot of headlines, understandable emotion, especially after certain events.
For sure. But the key question for us, as always, is what does the actual large-scale research, the data, what does it really tell us?
Right. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We've got this stack of your sources, peer-reviewed studies, some really detailed data analysis from think tanks, reporting that looks at common narratives.
Yep.
And we're going to unpack what this evidence actually says about that link, or lack thereof, between immigration status and crime rates.
And it's a good set of materials for this. We've got a really specific look at Texas data from PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That's a major journal. Then we have broader national analysis from the Cato Institute and also National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. That gives us the bigger picture, some historical context, too.
And then you also pull some reporting from NPR, and PolitiFact looks like they worked with Al Jazeera on one piece.
That's right. And those pieces tackle some of the common public misperceptions head on, things you hear repeated a lot.
Got it. So the aim here isn't about opinions. It's about understanding what these specific studies and reports found, seeing how those findings stack up against, well, the stuff you hear all the time.
Exactly. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with something that jumped out right away for the sources.
Yeah.
Actually getting reliable nationwide data that breaks down crime by immigration status. It's surprisingly hard.
Oh, yeah. That's a fundamental challenge. Your standard big crime databases, think FBI reports, the UCR, or victim surveys like NCVS, even the more detailed NIBRS system.
Oh, yeah.
They just weren't built to systematically track immigration status. They track age, race, sex, sure, but not citizenship or legal status as a standard field.
So trying to get that clean national picture from those usual sources is, well, basically a non-starter.
Pretty much. Which is exactly why these specific sources you gathered are so valuable. They found ways around that data gap.
How do they manage that?
Well, take the PNAS study on Texas. Texas is kind of unique. State law there mandates really comprehensive arrest data. It's called CCH.
Okay, CCH in Texas.
And crucially, the researchers were able to link that state arrest data with DHS info, Department of Homeland Security, specifically from the Secure Communities Program, or ESCO-MM.
Ah, so they could connect arrests to immigration status.
Exactly. For jailable offenses with pretty low rates of missing data on status, that's something most other states just can't do easily.
Okay, that makes the Texas data pretty powerful then. What about the national studies, Cato and NBER?
So for the national view, they use different tools. Big data sets like the American Community Survey, the ACS, or census data, and they have to apply some pretty sophisticated statistical methods.
Like what?
Things like modified residual methods. It's basically a way to estimate population sizes and characteristics like immigration status within these huge data sets where you can't just look up an individual status directly.
So they're estimating the populations to figure out the rates.
Right. They take the best available large-scale data and use rigorous statistics to calculate things like incarceration rates for different groups, native-born, legal immigrants, undocumented immigrants.
Gotcha. So maybe not perfect given the data limits, but these are serious attempts to get evidence-based answers.
Definitely represents the state of the art in trying to answer this question with the available data.
Okay, so now we understand the data landscape a bit better. Let's dive into the headline findings. Maybe start with the national picture, looking at incarceration rates. That NBER study gives us that amazing long view, right? Back to 1870.
Yeah, 1870 all the way to 2020. And what's really, truly striking from their work is the consistency over that entire 150-year period.
What do they find?
Immigrant men have consistently had lower incarceration rates than U.S.-born men.
Wait, lower. For 150 years straight.
Lower. Consistently lower.
Wow. That feels completely counter to the narrative you often hear today.
It absolutely does. And the NBER study points out something else fascinating happening more recently. Since about 1960, that gap has actually widened.
Widened? meaning immigrants are even less likely to be incarcerated now compared to the U.S.-born relative to how it was in, say, 1960.
Exactly. They find that today, immigrants overall are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than all U.S.-born men combined.
60%.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference, not just a little bit lower.
It's a massive difference. And they also broke it down further, compared specifically to U.S.-born white men. Immigrants today are 30% less likely to be incarcerated.
Okay, 30% less likely than U.S.-born white men. Still significant. And the Cato Institute study, that looks at the more recent period, 2010 to 2023. Does it find the same thing?
Yes. Cato confirms that overall pattern, but adds more granularity by breaking down the immigrant population by legal status.
Ah, okay. What did they find there?
They show this really clear hierarchy across that whole period, 2010 to 2023. Legal immigrants, consistently the lowest incarceration rates, native-born Americans, consistently the highest rates.
And undocumented immigrants.
Undocumented immigrants fall in the middle. Lower than native-born Americans, but higher than legal immigrants.
Can you give us the actual numbers for the most recent year in their study, 2023? That really helps visualize it.
Sure. For 2023, Cato calculated the rate for native-born Americans at 1,221 per 100,000 people.
Okay, 1,221.
For undocumented immigrants, it was 613 per 100,000.
613.
And for legal immigrants, way down at 319 per 100,000.
So hang on. If native-born are at 1,221 and undocumented are at 613, based on Cato's 2023 analysis, undocumented immigrants are incarcerated at roughly half the rate of native-born Americans.
That's exactly what the numbers show, about half the rate.
And legal immigrants are even lower than that.
Much lower. Less than half the rate of undocumented immigrants and about a quarter of the rate of native-born Americans.
That's really striking data. Okay, so that's incarceration nationally. Let's switch gears to that Texas study from PNAS. It used arrest data, right? Not incarceration, covering 2012 to 2018, focusing on felonies.
Right. This gives us a different angle. Are people getting arrested less in the first place? Using that unique Texas data set we talked about, linking arrests and immigration status.
And what did PNAS find in Texas regarding arrests?
They compared undocumented immigrants, legal immigrants, and native-born U.S. citizens. Their finding was pretty clear. Undocumented immigrants had substantially lower felony arrest rates across the board, violent crimes, drug crimes, and property crimes, compared to both legal immigrants and native-born citizens in Texas during that period.
Substantially lower than both other groups. Did they put numbers on how much lower?
They did these relative comparisons, and yeah, they're quite stark. They calculated that U.S.-born citizens were over 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes compared to undocumented immigrants.
2 times more likely for violent crime arrests.
Okay.
For drug crimes, U.S.-born citizens were 2.5 times more likely to be arrested. 2.5 times.
And for property crimes, U.S.-born citizens were over 4 times more likely to be arrested than undocumented immigrants in Texas.
Over 4 times more likely for property crimes. That's a huge gap.
It really underscores the difference they found in that specific robust data set. And it's worth adding, the Cato Institute also did some analysis using Texas conviction data, not just arrests.
Okay.
And they found lower conviction rates for illegal immigrants compared to native-born Texans, too, even for homicide convictions.
So the pattern holds up even when you look at convictions, at least in the Texas data.
Seems to, yeah. So whether you're looking at national incarceration data going back 150 years or recent Texas arrest and conviction data, the pattern that emerges is remarkably consistent.
Immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, appear less likely to be involved in crime, or at least less likely to be arrested or incarcerated for it, than native-born citizens.
That is the core finding that keeps coming up across these different studies, different time periods, different methodologies.
Okay, what about trends over time more recently? Have these rates been changing?
Well, in that Texas PNAS study, looking at 2012 to 2018, the share of arrests involving undocumented immigrants actually stayed pretty stable, maybe even decreased slightly over those years.
So no surge in their share of arrests in Texas during that time?
Doesn't look like it. And nationally, the Cato data covering 2010 to 2023 showed incarceration rates actually fell for all the groups they looked at.
All groups went down.
Yeah. Native-born rates dropped 23%, legal immigrant rates dropped 38%, and illegal immigrant rates dropped 36% over that 13-year period.
Interesting. So a general decline in incarceration across the board during that time.
Mostly. Cato does note a small uptick in the illegal immigrant incarceration rate just between 2022 and 2023, but the overall trend for the longer period was definitely downwards for everyone.
We should remember the NBER finding about the long view. The gap between immigrants and the U.S. born has actually gotten wider since 1960.
Right. That relative difference, immigrants being less likely to be incarcerated, isn't new, but it's become more pronounced over the last 60 years or so.
Okay, so this is where I think it gets really interesting. These findings challenge a lot of common assumptions. The researchers must know this, right? So they test their own work, look for flaws, these robustness checks.
Absolutely. Good research always involves trying to poke holes in your own findings, anticipating the tough questions. And a big one here is always about the population estimates, especially for the undocumented population.
Right, because it's hard to count that group accurately. And if your population number, the denominator in the rate calculation is way off, your crime rate calculation could be wrong too.
Exactly. So the PNAS Texas study tackled this head on. They used estimates from reliable sources like the Center for Migration Studies, Pew Research, and they checked if using slightly different population estimates would change their main conclusions.
And did it?
Not significantly, no. But they did something else really clever, too. They calculated. Okay, how much smaller would the undocumented population in Texas actually have to be for their violent crime arrest rate to equal the rate for U.S.-born citizens?
Ah, like a break-even point calculation. What did they find?
They found the estimated undocumented population would need to be less than half, only 45% of the current best estimate to make the violent crime arrest rates equal.
Less than half the estimated number.
And for property crime arrests, it was even more extreme. The population estimate would have to be cut down to just a quarter, 23% of the current estimate to make the rates equal.
And is that plausible? Could the estimates be that far off?
The PNAS authors call those scenarios highly implausible. Basically, the actual population would have to be drastically, unbelievably smaller than any credible estimate suggests, just to erase the difference in crime rates they found.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty strong check on the population estimate issue.
Uh,
What about data accuracy? Like, could people be misclassified? The PNAS study used that DHS ident database, right? Have there been questions about that?
Yeah, they acknowledge potential misclassification is always a possibility with large administrative databases like ident, but they make a really critical point about the direction of potential errors.
What do you mean?
Think about it. If the errors involved, say, U.S. citizens or legal immigrants being incorrectly labeled as undocumented in the system,
Okay.
that kind of error would actually make the calculated crime rate for the undocumented group look higher than it really is. It would incorrectly assign crimes committed by citizens or legal immigrants to the undocumented category.
Ah, I see. So if anything, that kind of error would reduce the gap they found or mask an even larger difference.
Exactly. Potential misclassification in that direction would bias the results against their finding of lower crime rates for undocumented immigrants. The true gap could potentially be even wider.
That's a really important nuance. What about deportation? Could higher deportation rates explain lower incarceration, like offenders just get removed instead of imprisoned here? The NBER study looked at that.
They did. It's a reasonable hypothesis, right? Maybe the decline in relative incarceration is just because more people are getting deported before or instead of serving time.
Makes sense to check.
But NBER found that wasn't the main driver. They point out first that the relative decline in immigrant incarceration started way back in the 1960s, long before the big surge in deportations around the year 2000.
Yeah, the timing doesn't fit perfectly.
Right. And second, they see the same relative decline in incarceration rates among citizen immigrants, people who were born abroad but became U.S. citizens, and those individuals cannot be deported.
Ah, so if deportation was the main reason, you wouldn't see the same trend among citizen immigrants.
Correct. They also did checks like excluding areas with lots of ICE detention facilities, and the gap still persisted, sometimes even got bigger when comparing specific groups like Mexican and Central American immigrants to U.S.-born white men.
Okay, so it seems like the core findings hold up even after these rigorous checks. So if the data consistently shows immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, have lower crime and incarceration rates, why? What are the potential explanations the researchers offer?
The studies float several possibilities, often drawing on existing theories from sociology and criminology, especially about first-generation immigrants.
Like what?
Well, one big idea is related to assimilation theory. The basic thought is that first-generation immigrants, the ones who actually made the journey, often tend to be less crime-prone than folks born in the host country.
Okay.
The NBER study mentions that as later generations, second, third, become more culturally and socially integrated or assimilated, their crime rates might start looking more like the rates of the native-born population.
So the difference might fade over generations.
That's the idea. And Cato notes something consistent with this. They found immigrants who arrive younger or who have lived in the U.S. longer are actually more likely to be incarcerated as adults, which kind of fits that assimilation pattern.
Hmm.
The longer you're here, the more your outcomes might resemble the native-born.
Interesting. Okay, what else?
Another major theory is selective migration. Both PNAS and NBER mention this. The argument here is that the act of migrating itself, especially over long distances, is really hard. It tends to select for certain kinds of people.
What kind of traits?
Maybe people with higher motivation, more ambition, perhaps less aversion to certain kinds of risks, but maybe more aversion to criminal risk, maybe more entrepreneurial. The idea is these traits, which help someone successfully migrate, might also make them less likely to get involved in crime compared to the general population they left, or even the population here.
So the migration process itself filters for people less likely to commit crimes.
That's a theory, yeah. A third factor, which PNAS and NBER both highlight, is deterrence. And this is especially relevant for undocumented immigrants.
You mean the fear of getting deported?
Exactly. For someone without legal status, any run-in with the law, even for something relatively minor, carries this huge additional potential penalty. Deportation, being removed from the country, separated from family, losing everything you've built here.
That's a massive extra consequence compared to what a citizen faces.
Right, so that creates a really powerful incentive to avoid any criminal behavior that could possibly lead to arrest or conviction. It might just be a much stronger deterrent than the penalties citizens face.
That makes intuitive sense. Any other explanations?
The NBER study also points to broader socioeconomic trends. They suggest that widening gap in incarceration rates since 1960 might be part of a bigger picture.
How so?
They found similar divergences between less educated immigrants and less educated U.S.-born men in things like staying in the labor force or family formation patterns. They kind of speculate that maybe immigrants were less impacted by declines in certain industries, or perhaps had traits that helped them adapt better to economic shifts during that period compared to some less educated native-born groups.
So it could be tied into larger economic and social forces affecting different segments of the population differently over decades.
That's the more complex, nuanced picture the NBER study explores. It's not just about immigration status in isolation.
Okay, which brings us squarely to the public conversation. Because everything we've just discussed, lower crime rates, lower incarceration for immigrants, including the undocumented section, it seems to stand in really sharp contrast to so much of the political rhetoric and the narratives we hear constantly.
Oh, absolutely. It's a stark difference. And sources like NPR and PolitiFact really highlight that this isn't new. This narrative connecting immigrants, especially certain groups of immigrants, to crime has a very long history in the U.S.
Yeah.
It tends to flare up during times of increased immigration or, during election cycle.
Right, and that Harvard report on misperceptions you included, it directly addresses this mismatch, doesn't it?
Very directly. It states clearly that credible research finds immigrants have significantly lower crime, arrest, and incarceration rates than U.S.-born people. And it also explicitly adds there's no established link between immigration and higher risks of terrorism, which is another narrative you sometimes hear.
And PolitiFact, in their piece with Al Jazeera, they went through specific, widely circulated claims and fact-checked them.
They did. They looked into stories like Haitian immigrants supposedly eating pets in Ohio, or claims of Venezuelan gangs taking over buildings in Colorado or Chicago, school buses being hijacked in California, suspects let go because of sanctuary city policies in Wisconsin. These very specific, often alarming stories.
And what did they find when they investigated those claims?
They reported that many of these specific viral claims turned out to be false, or at least greatly exaggerated, when they checked with local authorities and did their own reporting. The facts on the ground often didn't match the sensational headlines.
So the anecdotes driving the migrant crime wave narrative often crumble under scrutiny.
That seems to be the pattern PolitiFact found again and again. And the experts they interviewed suggested this rhetoric is often politically motivated.
How so?
Tapping into fears, sometimes xenophobia, creating what sociologists call moral panics, or a sense of minority threat. The idea being that stirring up these fears can be politically advantageous, can mobilize voters.
Using fear for political gain.
That's what the experts cited in the reporting suggest is often happening. Now, it's really important to be clear here, and the sources acknowledge this. Immigrants do commit crimes, sometimes tragic, terrible crimes. PolitiFact mentions the awful Laken Riley case and the real documented presence of some Venezuelan gangs involved in crime. Nobody denies that.
Right. The data doesn't say zero crime.
Exactly. But the crucial point the research makes is that extrapolating from these individual cases, however tragic, to paint a picture of a general migrant crime wave just isn't supported by the overall large-scale data on crime and incarceration rates that we've been discussing.
And PolitiFact also pointed out, didn't they, that broader crime trends don't seem to track with immigration flows. Like the big homicide spike in 2020 happened when border crossings were actually down.
Yes, that was another data point they highlighted. It suggests other factors, completely unrelated to immigration levels at the border, were likely the main drivers of that national homicide increase. It further disconnects overall crime trends from immigration flows.
Okay. So given all these findings that seem to contradict the common narrative, what do the researchers or the think tanks suggest in terms of, say, policy implications?
Well, the Cato Institute is pretty direct about it, based squarely on their finding that illegal immigrants have lower incarceration rates than native-born Americans. They argue it might be an inefficient use of scarce law enforcement resources to target all illegal immigrants indiscriminately for identification and deportation purely based on status, if the goal is crime reduction.
Because the data suggests that group isn't disproportionately driving crime rates.
Right. They also argue that federal efforts to pressure so-called sanctuary cities, based on the premise that those policies drive up violent or property crime, aren't really supported by the data either.
So what do they recommend instead?
Cato suggests focusing enforcement resources more precisely on identifying and removing non-citizens, whether they are here legally or illegally, who have actually been convicted of serious violent or property crimes. A targeted approach based on criminal convictions, not just immigration status.
That makes sense based on the data they present. What about other recommendations?
A common thread mentioned by both Cato and PNAS is the need for better data collection. We still need more consistent, systematic tracking of immigration status within the criminal justice system across the entire U.S. to get an even clearer picture.
Better data for better understanding. Makes sense.
And finally, that Harvard report on misperceptions brings it back to the human element. They stress that actively countering these negative, often false narratives about immigrants and crime is really important because fostering a more welcoming society, one based on facts rather than fear, is crucial for the healthy development and successful integration of immigrant families, and especially their children. Kids who are immigrants or have immigrant parents make up a huge chunk of the U.S. child population, about a quarter, I think.
Wow. 1 in 4 kids.
Yeah. And growing up in an environment fueled by hostility and misinformation isn't good for them. And ultimately, it's not good for the country either. It impacts their well-being, their integration, their future contributions.
So the way we talk about this, the accuracy of the public narrative, has real consequences for millions of people, especially kids.
Absolutely. And highlights the connection between the data, the discourse, and people's actual lives.
Okay, so wrapping this up.
Yeah.
What does all this mean for you listening to this? Based on this deep dive into a pretty robust set of sources, looking at data stretching back 150 years, detailed state-level data, national analyses, fact checks of common claims, the finding that comes through again and again, is that immigrants, and that includes undocumented immigrants, are generally less likely to be involved in crime or end up incarcerated compared to native-born U.S. citizens.
And these studies didn't just present the finding. They used strong methods. They performed sensitivity checks on things like population numbers and data accuracy, and the main conclusions held up under that scrutiny.
And this finding stands in really stark contrast to a lot of the public debate, the political rhetoric, and specific stories that circulate, many of which, as PolitiFact showed, don't hold up when you actually check the facts.
Right, and the researchers offer plausible reasons for why this difference might exist. Things like who chooses to migrate in the first place, selective migration, how people adapt over generations, assimilation, the added fear of deportation acting as a deterrent, and maybe even broader economic shifts affecting different groups differently.
It's definitely a complex picture, not a simple soundbite, but the overall direction of the data across these studies seems remarkably consistent.
It really does.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on after hearing all this. Given this consistent evidence suggesting immigrant groups, especially that first generation, tend to be less prone to crime than their native-born peers, what does that tell us about the factors beyond immigration status that are the real drivers of crime in the U.S.? And maybe how could understanding that change how you think about not just immigration policy, but also about how we approach public safety more broadly? Where should the focus really be?
Yeah, that's a powerful question to consider. If immigration isn't the driver the narrative suggests, what is, and what do we do about that?
something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
My pleasure. Always interesting stuff.